Okay, welcome to the End of Life Ministry panel. Very happy to see all of you here. And we have 4 panelists. The first panelist is going to be Debra Rodgers. Debra is a recently retired long-time hospice worker. She is also a nurse, a registered nurse. And Debra practices within the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. Our second panelist is Abhaya, Kyira Korrigan, who is an Kyira, and she is also a prison chaplain in Canada and also teaches various courses related to end of life in England. That's a very short summary of her long, biography. The third panelist is Ken Gorczyca, Dr. Ken Gorczyca, and he is a veterinarian in San Francisco. And Ken did a lot of work during the AIDS pandemic, trying to help by developing the human-animal bond and working to have people who were suffering from HIV/AIDS have a companion at the end of life or through their, illness. And so Ken is going to be speaking primarily from his experience as a teacher in a very interesting program, which is a companion animal end-of-life doula training program at the University of Vermont. And then our fourth panelist is my friend Taylor Bell, who's a yoga teacher and many other things in Texas. And she is training, or have you completed your training already as a doula, an end-of-life doula, also in Texas? And she's going to talk about her training and some of the things she's liked about her training and some of the things she feels are missing in her training. So let us begin with Debra.
You're still muted. Let's see here. Okay, first I put you on spotlight and maybe that made it hard to. Okay, hold on.
Wonderful, thank you. Actually, I was getting an error that said the host is not allowing you to unmute yourself.
Well, I didn't mean that.
And I didn't know what to do about that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for such a wonderful introduction to me and to everyone, Lourdes. I have been asked to talk about the challenges and rewards in hospice. And first, I'd just like to tell you about my experience with hospice, which is probably not as great as you all seem to think it is. I have worked as a partner collaboratively with hospice for quite a few years. When I was working first as an oncology nurse and then in palliative care in the hospital. And I took the opportunity to sit in on some hospice interdisciplinary meetings, and I helped with the handoff between being in the hospital and going home with hospice. And I think what I learned in that experience was just about the amazing compassionate care that's given right from the very beginning, from the first moment when the intake nurse from hospice entered a patient's room in the hospital, just the love and the care and the kindness that was given. So that was really wonderful. I got to be exposed to a couple of different hospice models. There's the medical model, which is defined by the Medicare benefit, and where care is given by an interdisciplinary team that includes a doctor, nurse, an aide, a chaplain or spiritual care provider, a social worker, and often or sometimes other disciplines like massage therapy or music therapy, art therapy. And so that's the medical model. The other model that I was exposed to is the social model, where the medical care is given by a medical hospice, but the non-medical hospice provides social work and spiritual care, and sometimes in the patient's own homes or wherever they live, and sometimes in a hospice house. So for example, in Santa Barbara, we had 2 hospice houses. One was the medical model, and the other one was Sarah House, which was started during the AIDS epidemic, and was specifically started to care for people who had AIDS who did not have any funding. And so it was a place where they could be cared for with love and cared for well. And then later it came to when there began to be good medical treatments for HIV/AIDS, the hospice house opened its doors more to anyone who didn't have health care and couldn't get the hospice benefit. So then when I did my CPE residency, that was a year-long residency at Gunderson Hospital in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Again, I worked on the palliative care team as the chaplain. And again, I worked very closely with palliative care and hospice. And I became very close friends with 2 physicians as well as other people. And so I got to learn a little bit more. And again, just of the amazing care that's given. Then when I moved to Iowa, I wasn't able to find a job as a chaplain or a spiritual care provider. There just isn't much need for Buddhist chaplains here in the Midwest. So I got a job as a nurse again, but my employer was very happy for me to provide care out of all of my training, which includes spiritual care training, my MDiv. And I worked as team director of a small hospice house in southwest rural Iowa, not too far from the border with the state of Missouri. And so there, I got to learn much more about the Medicare benefit, the regulations, and just, the ins and outs of hospice care, who's eligible, who's not. And then along with that, again, just the amazing care that's given. And I did that for 2.5 years. And then finally, this last year in 2021, I was living in California and taking care of my mother with, I would say she had mid-stage dementia. And I took care of her for 8 months, and I got to experience palliative care and hospice as a receiver of care. So it kind of came full circle for me. One of the things about hospice is that for someone with dementia to be eligible, it has to be very advanced, where they're not eating, they have lost quite a bit of functionality and things like being able to dress and bathe themselves. And that is, so the Medicare benefit requires that 2 physicians certify that the person, if their illness follows a normal course, will not live more than 6 months. And the really sad thing about that about dementia is that people need that full team service, that wraparound care for years. And it was very frustrating that I couldn't get it from my mother. But I did find a community palliative care service that provided a nurse and a social worker. And it was provided by a hospice organization. So I knew that if and when the time came, we would be able to enroll in hospice quickly with this organization because we were already enrolled in care, and we'd have the same nurses and social worker. So that's kind of my experience with hospice. And talking about challenges, I would say mostly the challenges in hospice stem from the Medicare regulations and financial constraints. The caseloads are can be high. And as a chaplain, spiritual care providers are required by Medicare to do initial assessment, to do periodic visits to provide care and reassess, and then to be present within the last 24 hours of care. And so when it becomes clear that someone is actively dying, the chaplain is required to go. So a chaplain might carry, 30, 40 or more people on their caseload. And there's no way that you can really get to know all those people. So chaplains tend to kind of assess who needs their care and their presence and their attention the most. And also rely on not only their own assessment, but the assessment of the nurses and the aides, those and the social workers, the other members of the team, as to when needs change. If they don't have a scheduled visit, they might get a call to go. And then I would say other challenges come from cultural perceptions and fears. A lot of people don't choose to receive hospice care until just a few days before they die. And it's sad because we're entitled to that care, and the care and support that can be given is just wonderful. And then I would say another challenge that I see in hospice is that quite honestly, there are large groups in the community or in populations who just don't get hospice care. They don't get offered, or if offered, they have fears about it. And so we're not serving everyone we could. So I see that as a challenge. The rewards are many of the same rewards that all of us who care for people who are dying, or animals who are dying, experience. It's just an honor to be a part of the most intimate and sacred times in people's lives. And I'm just, kind of humbled by how people open up and allow me in at those times. Sometimes you get to witness healing and transformation, or even reconciliation, not always, but sometimes you do. And that's also very rewarding. And then just in the end, I would say our patients and families teach us so much. I think I'd just like to maybe share a couple of stories and a couple of more comments, and then just leave some time for questions or discussion later. I think, so I have been fortunate to sit at the bedside with a lot of people when they died. And they all touched me, but some of the ones that touched me the most were when I was called to be there when loved ones couldn't. And sometimes I would have had a relationship with them prior, and sometimes I just walked in. And I remember one man in particular, this was in the hospital, who the nurses, I got the referral when I was on palliative care to come and sit with this man. And he had had an accident and had been brought in, or been picked up and brought in, and they didn't even know his name, but he was dying. And so this was, in that moment, what I experienced was the most raw human connection. Here is a human being. We don't know a thing about him, but he's a human being like I am. And I just felt like, I felt very, I don't know, I can't even describe what I felt, but just to be able to sit and be a caring presence when he wouldn't have had that otherwise. At the hospice house, then on the opposite end of the spectrum, at the hospice house, we had a woman who was 97 years old come in, and she had had a heart attack, and she wasn't expected to live more than a couple of days. Well, she ended up living with us for a year, and we ended up having to graduate her from hospice because she no longer qualified for the benefit. But oh, did we come to love her, and she came to love us. And she had lived in rural Iowa on a farm with her husband. Her whole life had been in that area, and she had so many stories to tell, and it was just such joy. There was another person at the hospice house, a woman, and her family came in, and she was expected maybe to live a couple of weeks. And the thing she wanted most was to see her son, who was in prison. And again, this was, people who from that community had lived in the community their entire lives. And this man, so I'm just going to kind of talk around it because I need to observe confidentiality. So this man, something had happened in the community, and it had torn the community apart, and he had ended up being convicted and was serving a prison sentence, and was serving in a high security prison because there was concern that he would be attacked. And when I first tried to arrange a visit, I called the prison, talked to the warden, wasn't there, talked to assistants, and had conversation over a number of days, and kept getting no, it's not safe, we can't do this. And finally, I did get a hold. The warden came back from his long weekend vacation, and I just shared with him my experience as a volunteer chaplain in the LA County jails, and just told him, one of the most painful things for people who are incarcerated is when a loved one dies and they can't be there. And excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water. And he again told me he couldn't do it, that it wouldn't be safe. But then half an hour later, I got a call that they were going to show up in 2 hours, and would we be ready, and would we do this, that, and the other to secure his safety. And so that happened. And that's one of those moments that is just so incredibly rewarding that it ended up happening. I think my throat's telling me I need to finish up here. So I just jotted down, as I was thinking about this talk, a couple of things that I'd like to share from my experience. And the first one is advice you've probably heard before, and that is when you're with someone, with someone who's dying, sit down when you're with them in their room or in the hospital or in their home, sit down, don't stand over them. Sit down and take your time, even if you don't really have much time. And one example I'd like to tell of this is a man in the hospital in Wisconsin who had come in and out of the hospital during the year that I was there. And the last time he came in, it was clear that he wouldn't survive his condition, and he was told. And he was kind of a man who had lived kind of a rough life, had been had some struggles with addiction, and had some encounters with the law connected with that, and hadn't ever really wanted to talk. And honestly, there was kind of a big gap between his background and my background, which I felt something of a barrier there. So I just continued to visit. I was persistent all through that year. Every time he came in, I spent time with him. And we never really talked about what was going on with him or much of what was important. But that last time, one day I decided, I'm just going to sit down. He was watching a program about fishing on the television from his bed. And so I sat down in the chair, I turned it to face the television, and I didn't even look at him. And so I'm just sitting there watching, and all of it, and maybe 10 minutes into it, he starts talking about how he's concerned when he dies that God is going to be angry with him because of the things he's done in his life. And I just listened. And he talked for quite a while. And so that just sitting down and watching fishing with him is what made it safe for him to talk, and not looking at him is what made it safe for him to talk. And I don't know that he had talked with anyone else. So that was really, for me, a very rewarding moment. Then I'd like to share a couple of questions that I ask people that are open-ended and allow them to talk. And one of them is, rather than asking, how are you or how are you doing, which is kind of the common greeting, I ask, how are you within yourself today? And people can either answer on a surface level or they can go deep. And so they can do whatever they are comfortable and safe with. And often it will open up very deep conversations. And then another question is, as you think about the days ahead, what is most on your mind? And amazing things come back from that question. And then the final one is, how has your relationship to spirituality changed since you've been sick? And if I know that they're Christian or Jewish or have a traditional faith, or if I know something about their beliefs, I might ask, how has your relationship to God changed since you've been sick? And that's another one that just opens up sometimes things, allows them to talk about things that they may not have been able to talk about to anybody else. And then just to end, I don't know if I've talked over my time, I'd just like to just confirm the value of chaplaincy and hospice by telling you a little bit about my mother's story. So at the very end, just as my mother was getting ready to move into a memory care facility, which she didn't want to do, she suddenly became very sick with a lot of chest pain. And we went to the emergency room, and she was diagnosed with pneumonia, which while we were there turned septic. And they did a lot to try to change the course of that. But none of it was successful. And really what she wanted. She had been praying for days and even weeks that God would take her and she would be reunited with my father. But it was really rough in the hospital. Her dementia was pretty bad at that point. And we think she had some underlying mental health conditions, and she was very quick to anger. And my mother, this little 80-pound barely 5 foot woman was fist fighting with the nurses and had to be sedated. And it was really, really painful for her and for us. And this went over the course of several hours. And finally, about 2 a.m, the doctors finally agreed to what I had been asking for, which was comfort care and palliative care. This was on a Sunday. So in the wee hours of Monday morning, finally they agreed, and we were waiting. She was sedated, and she was sleeping, and I was there alone with her, and just feeling exhausted and my own coping not there at all. Let me just say that. And we were waiting for a bed up on the floor for her to be admitted and to start receiving comfort care. And at 3:30 in the morning, suddenly this young man walks in the room. 3:30 on a Sunday to Monday morning, and he introduced himself as the chaplain. And I looked at him and I said, I know what just happened. I know that you got a call, that you were sleeping in your bed, and you got a call at 2:30 in the morning, and you jumped up and put your clothes on and came in here to be with me. And I can't tell you how much it meant to me in that moment that he did that. And I was surprised, and even now you can see I'm tearing up about it. So the care that we give is meaningful beyond our understanding and our imaginations, really. So I think I will end with that. And thank you for whatever time I've taken.
Thank you, Debra, and it's good seeing you. So we go to our next speaker, Abhaya. She is someone who has a lot of experience in many things. She's a teacher, a retreat leader, and she has been doing a lot of things lately. But I think that we have invited her here because she is a prison chaplain in Canada. Mm-hmm. And I know at least that there is in the audience a Canadian friend of mine. So I would like to introduce her today and perhaps give you some time to tell you about your experiences in end-of-life care in the prisons, or at least what you know about end of life in the prisons.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just say, Lourdes, I think you might have 2 bios there, because some of the things you gave me credit for, I can't take credit for. I never taught end-of-life classes in England. And
oh, no, retreat. You led retreats in England, didn't you?
Oh, I have. Okay.
Yeah.
So much information. Yeah, so I am a prison chaplain, and that means that I work full-time, 40 hours a week inside prisons. And for 5.5, almost 6 years, my first 6 years as a chaplain, I was in the hospital prison in British Columbia. So this would be a federal prison for inmates doing time over 2 years, so for more serious crimes. And it had medical hospital, elder care for Western Canada, as well as brain injury clinic and psychiatric hospital, and then some other populations. But in that part of the prison, I, of course, had to do end-of-life care, because we had a dedicated wing of one building that was the elder care building. So I'll just talk a little bit about, in general, what is the reality of care provided for end of life. Although there are some very nice words written in policies, federal policies in Canada, about meaningfulness or care or qualities that one could associate with a good death, there's really nobody in the prison whose job is to care in a good way for people. No staff person. The staff are all pretty much tasked with emergency triage on whatever level you're assessing triage, people getting out soon, people bleeding, people having mental health crises. There is a inmate peer caregiver program here in Canada, or at least there was, but it's sort of been downgraded now to more of like more basic. But we had 40 elder inmates and then 40 inmate care, 25 inmate caregivers, and they do most of the end of life care right up until the very end, when someone's so sick they have to move to the hospital prison, and then, or the hospital wing. And then when they go to the hospital wing, in general, they lose all visitors. So the peer caregivers cannot continue to be given access. If an inmate's died or is dying and he's coming from a different place, especially a higher security setting, then that person, that incarcerated person, will probably not be visited by anybody at all, and won't even be allowed to be out in the hospital area with the other incarcerated people there, because their security setting makes them dangerous. So security settings relate to how aggressively and continuously you're fighting your own incarceration. It's not about your crime. You don't go to high security because you had a violent crime. You go to high security because you are fighting the system physically and in your behavior. And so if you get to a high security rating and you get sick and you start to die, they don't bring down your security rating, even if you end up paralyzed, or they probably wouldn't handcuff you to a bed if you were actually unconscious. But there's quite a bit of very inappropriate and unnecessary security measures taken. Yeah, so there is some care available from your peers if you're dying in prison. There's always going to be a couple nice staff. Once you get close to death, you'll go into more of an isolation. So I'd say that everyone in prison who dies slowly dies in isolation and in what it would be the functional equivalent of segregation. Chaplains were allowed to find out about some level of medical information, but if someone was close to death, they would tell me. But what I found was that there was very little helpful information in the modern death literature I could find for how to do end-of-life care for these fellows. Without exception, everyone was most afraid that if they died in prison, their spirits would stay imprisoned, that there was a kind of very intense shared, I hope it's superstition, that if you die in prison, you never leave prison. And so we would talk about that more than anything else. And we would talk about their case management and all the ways that staff in the prison had betrayed them and forced them to be where they were. Whether that was accurate or not, some of the time there was a lot of other mitigating factors, but I think unlike maybe places where death can take place slowly, surrounded by people who love you and are bringing meaning, in prison, the closer I saw fellows go to the end of their life, in general, less they were willing to address any complicated, unresolved emotional issues. They become, in general, but consistently, very panicked and very distraught and very shut down. And besides that, there was the sort of prison staff scornfulness. The attitude prison staff often have is that you shouldn't care for inmates too much. They don't deserve too much love. So the few staff who actually would support inmates as they died, except for me, all other staff were really putting at risk their reputation as professionals, but even more putting at risk sort of their social comfort with their coworkers. There was several efforts made before me and when I was there by chaplains to try and bring a death doula program into the prison. But it was very hard to figure out how to get a volunteer with no prison experience to be able to go into a prison setting to do that kind of work. Plus, it all only could happen during two or three little 2-hour periods in a weekday. And we never made any real headway. I guess I'll just say in general that I've been advocating for even the most basic kinds of adjustments to how we handle death in prison with people all the way to Ottawa. And I have never seen anything really be picked up by anyone, because either the person is so far away from the frontline experience that they feel like the words that are written down in policy that sound so nice must be being put into place because all the staff are there, or they're so much closer to managing staff, like the mid-level management, that they know that they're not going to get better behavior from the staff they have. They're getting probably the best they'll get, and this is the best the inmates will likely get, and it's just not as high a priority. And so the overall thing I'll say about death in prison is that it is the hardest thing, pretty much beyond just complete mental health breakdown that I dealt with. And there's a whole layer on top of it of medical malpractice and disregard by professionals that makes everything I read about death doulaship or death end-of-life care really feel like it's one of the few things that makes me bitter. I think, oh my God, how can some people have such good deaths and other people just 2 or 3 buildings away, let's say the people across the street in the prison, have such horrible deaths, and we all just act like it's so important, but it never ever seems to permeate the walls of prison. So it's an emotional topic for me because it's been one of the most painful parts of prison chaplaincy. And it's I find maximum security prison is easier to deal with, and the violence there than the end of life care and hospital care I was doing at my first prison. I think that's all I've got for you right now.
Oh, that's quite a bit. Let me ask you just a quick question. Is that true in all provinces? Or do you feel that in other provinces there's a little bit more leeway or more understanding or more compassion than in BC?
That's hard to answer because by the time you get sick enough to be close to that, you tend not to transfer from site to site as much. I know there are only 2 elder care centers in Canada, one in the East Coast, one in the West Coast, and they're fairly new. So I don't know. I think there are differences based on just the places where prisons are located, hire the people that are nearby, and the culture of those people nearby gives you different behavior. Mm-hmm. But I also know that chaplaincy seems to be really similar across the country. In fact, BC is sort of nice to do chaplaincy. So maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. Could be either way, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very, very much. So we're doing good in our time, so we'll have time for discussion, questions, answers. So Ken Gorczyca is, as I may have mentioned, a veterinarian, and he does a lot of end-of-life care and teaches in the companion animal program for doulas at the University of Vermont.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to this lecture panel. We're going to move from people to animals, but in reality, every animal tends to have a human guardian. So we're going to be talking a lot about people as well. I live and work in San Francisco as a companion animal end-of-life euthanasia practitioner. I go into people's homes and euthanize their pet when it's ready in their own space. And it's a real privilege to do that. I'm also a veterinary facilitator at the University of Vermont Companion Animal End-of-Life Professional Doula Training Program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that course later on. My own experiences of being a death doula really started as I graduated from veterinary school and started to work in San Francisco at the edge of the Castro district. And I didn't really realize that as a veterinarian, a human disease was going to take over my career, but that was the beginning of the AIDS pandemic. And as a gay man that had a very large gay practice, I ended up losing probably over 300 clients over the next decade. And so I helped each one of them through their fears and angst move on. And of course, I also lost dozens of friends. So I didn't realize that what I was doing had a name. I didn't realize it was being a doula. But now that I look back through this lens, I see that's where I learned how to have that type of compassion. And I also had the privilege of helping my father die at home through hospice. And that really gave me some insights into the hospice movement that seemed to grow out of the AIDS pandemic as well. And so I just turned 65, and I was looking at trying to figure out what am I going to do for an encore career. And I was fortunate to have a friend, Ari Wozicki, who started a practice here in San Francisco at home pet euthanasia, and he invited me to shadow him. And I went out. I just immediately knew that this was my calling. I mean, it's one of these things that to do this type of work, you have to feel a calling. It's not for everybody, but I really felt empowered to help people and the animals during this precious moment of transition. And I do believe that my experiences in the AIDS pandemic really allowed me to have the skills and the knowledge to be able to work into this world. So let's just start out by describing what a companion animal end-of-life doula even means. And it's my belief and experience that all veterinarians and veterinary staff at some level are death doulas. We are working with people as we euthanize their pets. And so when I was in school, we didn't really have classes on that. We were taught the technical aspects of euthanizing a pet, and even that's changed over 35 years. But I look at the colleges now, and they are starting to teach students about this type of work, communication with clients, end-of-life work. And so I think it parallels society, which has also changed in how we look at death over the last 35 years. And as I said, veterinarians understand the technical aspects, but we are dealing with a human guardian, and and the human-animal bond is one of the more powerful entities that we find as humans. And so we are learning, we have to guide the humans through this very difficult moment. And I think that not only there's a growing movement of pet loss support group leaders, there's social workers in veterinary practice, there's now the veterinary death doulas that are out there trying. And I do believe that as the veterinary practice moves forward, that it'll behoove all of us to have a person that's dealing with death in the practice. So I'm really encouraged by that. And when I started to study veterinary medicine in the 1980s, the human-animal bond was, although we all know the power of it and from history, and it was just starting to become a science of its own. And we now know that animal companionship is a very powerful medicine. This is true for the aging population when your relationships diminish. And so sometimes the animal is your primary companion. It's true for disabled people, for people with illness. And during COVID, we've learned that the whole population benefited from having animal companions during social isolation. And so it's not a surprise that when we look at the final bookend of a human-animal bond relationship, that we deal with a very powerful entity. And it's my belief that the ending of an animal's life is just as important as those years of unconditional love and companionship, and really how we as individuals or as veterinarians or as clients deal with those last moments really will be ingrained in who we are as people. And so one of the things that this movement of at-home euthanasia practitioners, that's now a growing movement, is doing, it not only helps the animals, they can be in their own environment, they don't have to take a car ride to the hospital and sit on a steel cage or steel table in their final moments. It helps the clients, they can have their family members and other animals around during this process. And it's helping the veterinary community itself, because one of the big issues in the veterinary world right now is compassion fatigue. And my profession is undergoing a lot of mental stresses. It has a very high suicide rate. And so it's my belief that practices like my own are actually helping the profession in general, so they don't have to take on that extra euthanasia stress when they're there mostly to try to help animals survive. And I just want to move into some of the resources that are out there right now. And as I mentioned, the University of Vermont has a very interesting and innovative program. It's called the Companion Animal End of Life Doula Training Program. And what we're finding is that through their human doula program, which was for birth and death doulas, they created this program to help individuals try learn how to be supportive during this ending of the human animal bond. And it's been in progress maybe for 2 or 3 years now. And there's a lot of individuals that really want to participate and help people in this type of ministry. And the ones that I've met are, there is no rules with this yet. So they're going into veterinary practices and trying to find a place for themselves. But there surely is a big issue in our society about pet loss. And a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with pet loss. There's pet loss support groups, there's pet loss counselors, therapists, and now there's pet loss doulas as well to help during that transition. And so for me, the class it's a 4-week online class, and I took it last summer. And it not only does it help you understand about the different issues of trying to be non-judgmental and even having quietness during these death issues, but it helps you be a better person in relationship, and that's what we find from, I think, anyone that does a doula training, you become a better person in your own life. So again, this is where the animal world, the human world has come in and helped the animal world, but it's a dance, because this is called one health or one medicine. And so what happens in the human world also happens in the animal world. And so it's a never ending dance, and it's exciting to see. The other, I'm going to talk about 2 other programs. There's the Companion Animal Euthanasia Training Program, and that's from the veterinary profession. And there's a woman, Dr. Kathy Cooney, and she created this organization to help train veterinarians to do better euthanasia practice. And then not only do they teach us the technical skills, but they're also now teaching us client communication around this issue. And so we're coming from the doula. They don't call it being a doula, but I suspect that down the road, these 2 areas are going to coalesce. And I'm really excited that they have a lot of programs for the veterinary community. And then finally, there's the International Association of Animal Hospice and Palliative Care. And this is an organization that brings the new fledgling career paths of hospice and palliative care and euthanasia that's happening in the veterinary world. And again, this is coming directly from the human understanding. It's only been in the last 5 to 10 years that we even talk about veterinary hospice or veterinary palliative care. And there are clients that want to make sure that their aging pets are taken care of until the last moment. And so there's people that specialize in, or veterinarians that specialize in that. And and there's also other organizations, other workshops. It's again, I look at it as a new wave in veterinary medicine. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about an appointment I had on Friday, and I get our hospital staff to speak with the clients, and they played the doula role as well to see where they are, what they need. And so I get the medical record, and I was going out to see Joker, who was a Australian Shepherd Golden Retriever mix. Joker was 14 years old, and I knew that he was no longer eating and he could no longer stand. So he was nearing death. And so I accepted the appointment, and I drove out to Nicasio Valley, which is in Western Marin County. It's about an hour from San Francisco. And I got to drive through the Golden Hills, and had some good music and did a little bit of meditation on the way. I try to get to the appointments in a very calm state so that it can be a vehicle for whatever's needed at that site. I have to listen to the people. I met the rancher. He was standing by his barn. He was wearing overalls and a cowboy hat, and we greeted each other. And of course, I told him I'm really sorry that I'm here for this day. And we walked up to his house, and on the porch was Joker sitting on a bed on the ground, and he was surrounded by the guy's 2 adult daughters and his future son-in-law. So that there was 4 of the family members were there for this event. And I immediately went up and greeted Joker. I petted him and looked in his eyes, and just to give him some connection to me so he could smell me and not be afraid. And I then let them know that this is going to be a life ceremony. We're going to use these moments together to celebrate Joker's life. And I asked, well, tell me, how did he get his name? That's and I start out with that a lot of times. And they told me that when they adopted him in Minnesota, when they went to visit their grandparents 14 years ago, this little puppy had black around his lips, and it looked like Joker on the film or something. And so they named him Joker. And they brought him back home to Marin County, where he lived on a ranch for the next 14 years, chasing deer and rabbits and just having a wonderful freedom of never having to be fenced in. He was just there. And I then tell them I try to be very transparent during this process so that they understand what's going on. I always ask them if they've been through a euthanasia before. And at this time, both of the daughters have never been through this. This was their first dog. And so I know where I should go in trying to explain what's going to happen. And I tell them that the first thing we're going to do is give a strong sedative injection. And this is going to put Joker into a deep sleep. And it takes about 10 minutes. And at the end of the 10 minutes, he should be anesthetized so that when I come back and pinch his toes, he won't react. And so that I know that he is no longer feeling any pain. And during those 10 minutes, I move away so I can allow the family to be around Joker so that they can spend these minutes offering gratitude and love to him. His eyes, when I saw him, they were just full of spirit. I could see he was still there, but his body had given out. And so it was time. And then I come back and tell them that the next step is we're going to give him a very strong medicine for the final injection, and that has to go into their bloodstream, because this medicine, it's a barbiturate, is what's going to cause his heart to stop, and it's going to have him pass on. And so I tell them that we're not going to. I'm just going to get the vein ready, and I won't give the injection until I let them know, so that they're prepared that when this happens. And so I got the injection ready, and I gave it, and Joker went into a deep sleep, and then he passed on within 2 minutes. And then I offer a final ceremony, and I asked them if they are interested or not. But I'm a trained shamanic practitioner, and I like to use a smudge stick and just to acknowledge his sacredness, his love and companionship. And in this case, they wanted me to proceed. So I go around his chakras, and I just say, thank you, Joker, for sharing your life with these people. And it's okay now to go. I tell them that dogs are not afraid of death like humans, and they just need to be released. And then I tell them I'm going to move back to my car and allow you to have some time with the body. Joker, this is still a part of the processing, the mourning process. And if that's what they want. And sometimes I have clients that will want to keep the animal overnight, which is absolutely fine if they want to go through this process of being with their pet. I've done that myself, and it's very powerful to go through the dying process. I think it's something that we as humans have lost. And 50 years ago, we all had our grandparents die at home. And now all we have is perhaps our animals dying home that teach us, or especially young children or young adults, that's the first death that they've actually had to experience. So that's really one of the privileges that I have to guide them. And then I come back when they're ready, and we gently wrap the animal in a blanket. If it's a small animal, we'll put them into a basket. And then we will have a ceremony bringing them back to the vehicle, which I have white flowers in the back, and it gives some sense of finality, and it's sort of like a final way to say goodbye. In this case with Joker, they lived out on a ranch, and so they had already dug a grave up in their pet cemetery. They had a lot of other pets that had passed, and so they were going to do this ceremony on their own. And so that's really the process that I, as a end of life veterinary doula, does. I say it's more about the humans than the animal. The technical aspect to me is very simple, and it's very gentle, and the animals there's no suffering whatsoever. It's much different than even when I was in school 35 years ago, where we didn't do the sedation aspect. We just went right to the final medicine, and that there was a lot of struggle. And if you brought them into the exam rooms, it was stressful for the veterinary staff. It was stressful for the animals. It was stressful for the owners. And so there's a movement now that even veterinary hospitals sometimes have a chapel room where they do this type of process. It's at-home vet euthanasia practice is a privilege for some. It's not for everybody. And so I'm glad to see that the veterinary profession is moving towards understanding how important this is. And when I'm done, I always tell people that their home is going to be empty, and that for me, what I find is taking walks in nature is healing, and I recommend that they do that for themselves. And of course, we offer clients resources for pet loss or grief counseling if necessary. I encourage children to be there during this process. Some parents are for it, some parents are against it, but I find that if the children are there, it's a very powerful experience, and they have some amazing questions, and they've never been harmed by it, as far as I can see. And of course, we also encourage other pets to be there if they would like. And so that's my sharing about animals and doulas and end of life issues. And I'll be glad to answer questions later if you have anything. But thanks for letting me share.
Thank you so very much, Ken. So let us have our last panelist, my friend Taylor, and telling us about her training as a doula and some of the things that were missing, some of the things you felt valuable, and so forth. And then we can open it for about 15 minutes for questions, comments, protests, concerns, etc. Go ahead, Taylor.
I say that. So yes, my name is Taylor. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm just so grateful to listen to Ken and Abhaya and Debra, because it gives me so much inspiration of what to look towards, even though I hear how hard. But I'll get into that more later. And just, well, let me get into some context. So my intimate experience with death was spurred by my mom's death in 2013. And she died at home, and it was anticipated. She was on hospice. She had a good death. And that was so profound to me, of like, oh, this is, everybody should have this if it's possible. And that just sparked something in my mind. And so, but meanwhile, I was in the Western yoga world, of which I'm slowly leaving, and doing this end-of-life companionship work. And I finished my certification in April, although I was told, like, you don't have to have that, but I'm very grateful I did it, because I learned a lot from the experience. And to answer your initial question, Lourdes, I don't really know, I don't have enough experience yet to really have any constructive feedback for the program, though I am just very grateful. It was a very good foundational care doula is what it's called. And the woman who runs it, she was a hospice nurse for 25 years, and then just went into end-of-life companionship, and a lot of valuable base level knowledge. So I was really grateful for that. It is very secular on purpose. So now I'm learning more from from like a Buddhist overlay to all of this. But something I find interesting, and as we're talking, and a question that Lourdes and I spoke about previously is how my experience perhaps in the yoga world, like what is that, how does that transfer, and also why are we seeing this movement towards death work? And I had a thought this morning, which is that, you know, when I got into yoga, which was 2008, obviously people have been doing trainings and stuff, but I feel like that's when it really started to level up, where a lot of yoga trainings came on and people could do it quicker and quicker. And then suddenly it was like you could do a weekend and be a yoga teacher. And so I do wonder if those of us like in my age bracket, I'm about to turn 40, you know, we're aging and we're expanding out, anybody in the wellness world, of like what's next. And I wonder if that has a lot to do with it, of just seeing beyond what we've been doing and how we can support people and the things that we have found that are important. How can we parlay that in new ways? And so I wonder if that doesn't spur some of this, because it's being talked about more and more, the death work. And I'm just going to go into this because I find it interesting. So I'm purposely leaving the westernized yoga world because it's a westernized yoga industry. And, you know, didn't know what I didn't know, but I know better now. So trying to do better and switch into end of life work. However, I see all the ways that this death work could go just exactly the same way the yoga world has gone. Commodified, appropriated, the person, like the doula, much like the yoga instructor, has all this power and knowledge that they can impart on you, and versus just like sharing information and creating communities that only those that are privileged can have what, you know, we have to offer. And like certifications mean a lot. Like the more you can get certified in different things, the better you are. Like, which is just, I mean, some is good, but it gets a little wild. And so that's something I'm very cognizant of, and I'm very curious to see how the conversation goes as far as seeing more and more people get these trainings, whatever they might be, and go into these situations. And I feel very strongly about using what I've learned and what I know, and just watching it before my eyes kind of implode in the yoga world, to be a warning of what could happen with death work and wanting that to not happen. And that's why I'm so inspired by, you know, I look forward to working. I am working one-on-one with people who are terminal. But like, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. And that it can be for people who are privileged to, you know, even if I'm not charging, you know, definitely not charging as much as private yoga lessons, where I'll tell you that much, right? Already learning, but still, you know, even at a more modest, you know, service, you know, fee, some people can't afford that. So that's where I'm so interested in looking at, like, how can information be shared so that people who are unhoused, so people who are incarcerated, where possible, can be supported, or staff being, you know, share the information with the people who were there. Which, Abhaya, I was curious if you had heard about, I think it's called Brother's Keeper. That's the inmates that help each other through the end of life process, which I watched a video and it was just one of the most moving things I've ever seen. But just that kind of thing, like these aren't new tools. These are just tools that have been lost, and to give them back to people and remind each other, I'm learning, let me share what I've learned and our experiences to do this all together, versus certain people just owning the information and can only have it at a certain price or something. So that's what's been interesting to me. And I'm looking at, as I'm brand new into this and just figuring some things out. So that's kind of where I stand right now.
We had talked before about your work in posture and
Mhm.
doing that work with people at the end of life. Could you just mention that, because that was interesting?
Sure, yes, which is actually what I'll be offering after this panel is, and I'm being mindful to not call it yoga. I'm not going to be talking about, the 8 limbs or any of the philosophy or anything like that. It really is a posture practice, or even better, what I've been calling it with clients is mindful movement. And what is really cool, in my opinion, is that so much of the asana, the physical yoga practice, not only can be adapted to be in a chair, but even supine, even lying down. And because what to me, what's the intention of the physical practice of yoga anyway? It's awareness of sensation, it's connection to breath, it's ways to be present to whatever is actually occurring. And so that has nothing to do with alignment or how you have to be on a mat and standing in $100 leggings. Like, none of that matters. It's just about the experience of it. And so I've been fortunate enough to work with somebody who is kind of trying this out with me for the first time, as she is terminal. And I was so pleased with her experience thus far, because she was like, this is something that just feels like a positive thing. It's not like, oh, you're dying, so let's talk about it, or like, what, let's make that the main focus. This gives me a chance to just do something for myself, to feel, to kind of process through, and breathe, and just feel like me for a little bit again. And that's that's gold right there. So yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Taylor. Any questions, any comments for any of the speakers? Well, as always, I have a question if nobody else has. Debra, I've been reading quite a bit about the trend here in the United States of hospices that started as nonprofits, now being sold to for-profit corporations. And the services of those hospices are going down the tubes as the work of the people who are, the providers, increases exponentially in order to increase the profit margins. Is that something that you're seeing?
Thank you, John. I don't have data. I don't have that kind of information, but I believe it, that it may very well be happening. And I would just say that from my own perspective, I would never work for a for-profit hospice, and I would never enroll in a for-profit hospice. I believe that the care that is given is different, and that the staff in a for-profit hospice are under even more pressure. Their censuses are higher, and they're trying their best to give the compassionate care that called them to hospice work, but that it's just very, very difficult. So, not that there aren't some good ones. I believe there are, but as a rule, I myself would not go with for-profit hospices. When I was looking for work here in the Midwest, when I moved here, I specifically, that was a consideration, that I wouldn't even approach a hospice that was for profit. Not-for-profit hospices I can't speak in generalities, but the three that I've been closest to have been caring and mission have been really strong. And the one that I work for now, or that I'm just retiring from, the compassion and caring is so very important. It's valued. I mean, our CEO spends the first third of every meeting asking for mission stories. And he's willing to pay his staff to take a half hour out of every meeting to talk about the care that they've been giving and the patients and the families who have touched them. So, and you would never see that in a for-profit hospice. So that's kind of my answer, I guess.
Yeah, it's a trend now. I believe now that more than 50% of all the hospices in the United States are for profit. That was not the case. And it's a very sad trend. Abhaya, I was wondering if Chris is around, and maybe you dealt with this in the prison ministry panel, but I wonder, Chris, if the situation in the US prisons in terms of end-of-life care, I've heard you talk about that, is the same as the one that Abhaya talked about.
I believe so. It sounds very similar, where there is a lot of isolation and people are separated. I know that as chaplains and volunteers, you are completely cut off from anyone. So I know they're cut off from the outside world, and they get cut off from their peers and support. Which actually, I do have a question for Abhaya. What is the reality, and is it possible, would it be possible to have inmates trained as doulas, so a peer support network in-house, or is that too chaotic for the system to handle?
I think the most realistic thing is that that would be too emotionally charged for most inmates to handle. Not that they wouldn't think they could, but in general, the guys who are going to, and I only work at men's prisons, but the guys where I've worked who would have the emotional maturity and the length of time in prison to decide they wanted to be trained like that would be guys who were also likely to die in prison. And the impact of having lifers help lifers, it may be 1 or 2 stories you'll get every 100 would be filled with light and life, but a lot of them are, I think, filled with people looking at their future. And a couple of the suicides I have, guys I've known who killed themselves, they were lifers helping lifers die. And for them, it was just when they got their final parole, or their parole hearing where they knew they were really never getting out. They're just like, well, I'm just going to kill myself now because I don't know if I'll have someone like me. A lot of people do the work because they also think it'll help them get out of prison faster. So there's complicated things there. Like, I think the closer you get to needing genuine emotional balance and capacity, the harder it is to ask inmates to do that, because they're also going to be constrained by a whole bunch of things. And then they'll have no support emotionally to be taken care of. I've seen care workers who help a person towards death or even to death if they die in their cells, and then they get a day off and it's a favor from the staff, and then the next day they're assigned someone new. And they live with the guys that they're caring for. They're in cells next door, and even though the nurses are supposed to come at night if there's a problem, a lot of times the nursing staff won't come, or maybe didn't even show up for work. And so they're living with the clients they care for, and the clients they care for are just a few years ahead of them in their own life plan, in the sense of, oh, that's me. It's a very, I love the idea, Chris, and I shouldn't just be negative. I think there's ways maybe it would be amazing, but very few people would have the emotional capacity to handle that, I think.
I have a question for you also on prison work. You mentioned something that is very interesting to me because I've seen it in the context of refugee camps and the feeling of some people who die in places they don't want to die, that their spirits get trapped there. Sometimes I even think of that because I always have wanted to go back to my country, and I feel, oh my God, I'm going to die here. And in spite of the fact that I'm a Buddhist and I shouldn't be thinking about that, sometimes the thought comes by. So do you work with them in some kind of, I don't know, tantric way of some sort, or so that to help them release the spirit prior to death, or talk about it?
I have done things like that. I have a small drum that an inmate made me to do the bedside work. I'm not a Tibetan practitioner, but we've certainly done guided meditations. I also have done work in cells and prison and hospital rooms. If they haven't already put a new inmate in, if someone dies in a place, I will do sort of my own made up ceremonial blessing and guidance. I offering guidance to the spirit of whoever's there. And I do it with enough noise so that the other guys around know what I'm doing, because I think it helps everybody come to resolution, thinking that there's a ceremonial release. But most of the men that I've worked with who died in the hospital, in prison, didn't wish to speak about the things from a Buddhist perspective or anything. They were very much Christian, so we would do prayers and
Right.
yeah.
Well, and that ties to what Ken was talking about, the kinds of shamanic practices he does with his work. And I think that all of us are, influenced by our own practices. And when we meet these kinds of challenges, then our practices can not only be a support for us, but give us some tools to address these issues, perhaps not even saying that where they come from. Because again, most of the people that I've worked with in these contexts, having to do with spirit release and everything, have not been Buddhist. And so you work in ways that are more secular even, so, or tying them to their own tradition. So anyway, any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I would like to say something. I want to thank you for bringing that up. And you, Ken, when you were talking about the honoring ceremony that you do, I was reminded that when I was working as an oncology nurse, we developed an honoring ceremony that we offered to families when their loved one died. And I can really attest to the power of honoring ceremonies and how beneficial they are after someone has died for, we don't know about the benefit to them, but certainly to their loved ones and their family. It's really immense. And Abhaya, what you said about, your own made up ceremony, actually, those are the best kind. And research actually bears that out, that creating a ritual or a ceremony for that specific situation or those specific people has the most benefit. So, yeah.
At the same time, we need to be a little bit careful, even within the Buddhist tradition. For example, I did many retreats with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he always talked about when you were dying, people massaging the feet. He liked to do that. If you do that to a Tibetan Buddhist when you're dying, this is not good, because we're not supposed to, touch anybody from the waist down while the person is in the process of dying. So all these practices, which I think are tremendously powerful, need to be done with a knowledge of the dying person. So I think we need to also be very careful. I think Abhaya was alluding to that with Christian evangelicals and so forth, but even within the Buddhist tradition, you have to be careful. So we have a few more minutes, or we can leave and go to the other panel or have a break, or so let the boss say.
I had a, I guess just to the group in general. So I've done a couple of 10-day Goenka Vipassana courses, and there's mindfulness of breathing at the nose, and then body scan meditation. And then Goenka teaches, become aware of the sensation. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And if it's pleasant, is there a habit of grabbing on? Or if it's unpleasant, a habit of pushing it away? And then, so he talks about, okay, that's just the practice that you do when you're doing a meditation course, but then you also, over time, try to just be doing it all the time in your daily life. And then he's saying, okay, well, even at the moment of death, basically you're just doing the same practice, that you're trying to be aware of sensations. Are they pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral? Is there a reaction to try to get rid of it? And if you can let go of the reaction and just stay with the sensation, then that just allows things to organically go forward. And so that may result in you leaving your body, but the point is just to be developing awareness and equanimity, and then letting things take their course, basically. So I'm just curious, how does that work when helping animals pass away? And then from a Buddhist context, I know Lourdes, the Tibetan teachings on powwow, where you're learning how to have your consciousness go out of the body. So I'm just wondering, in general, like, I guess I feel for myself and whoever I'm supporting, like, if a person can have awareness and equanimity, there's some organic karmic process going on that's beneficial to support, to keep happening, versus if they feel overwhelmed and then it's becoming, they're just caught up in reaction and there's no equanimity. And then the question would be, is it better then at that point to do euthanasia? Or so I'm just curious about that general understanding and that way of seeing things about the dying process, and how does it show up, whether if you're working with animals or working with people, or a combination.
Go ahead, Ken.
There's a dichotomy in animal death. There's a whole movement about natural death that parallels, I guess, human death in a way. And some people just believe that the animals should be supported to a final natural ending, and I don't have any problems with that, as long as the animal's not suffering, and that would mean that if they are going to go through a natural death, they should be supported with medications and painkillers and things that keep them from having difficulty, because sometimes animals do go into distress, and then it's but that could be part of the natural process that they need to go through, versus the euthanasia movement, where you have a window of opportunity of and it's really hard for people to decide, well, when is the right moment? But I always tell people that if you're in that window of end of life, there's never a bad moment, because you don't know what the future is going to hold for that animal, and you're offering them a gentle, good death, So, yeah.
We had a panel this morning about nonviolence and pacifism. And there was a really interesting discussion, and Alan Sinoke, who's the head of the Berkeley Center, reminded us Buddhists that we live and have to realize that we live with moral ambiguity, that, the Buddha didn't teach things that were necessarily written in stone. And also there are many interpretations, like, for example, one of the panelists said that the Buddha never encouraged pacifism, just to do as good as possible and trying not to harm any living being. And so there is no right way. You have to assess the situation in the same way that there are various possibilities, natural death, euthanasia, whatever in the human condition. I think that is the same, like what you're talking about, Ken. In terms of, you mentioned POA. POA can be done individually by the person who is dying. Most of us in the Tibetan tradition train to do POA. Actually, one of the things that first you have to do in doing, practicing Tantra in particular, is to always have a feeling of having something on the crown of your head. So you have to be continuously aware of the crown of your head, more than, your breath at the crown of your head. So you're trained that at a certain point, when, there are certain processes that are taking place, it would take a lot of time to discuss those, that you can send, your subtle energy through the crown of your head and out of your body, and not have to go through the bardo process. Another way is to have somebody do it for you. And there are some people in that tradition. And so it's a very powerful tradition. Whether it works or not, I don't know. I haven't died as yet, so I'll figure it out. Like a lot of people ask me when I teach, do you really believe that? I said, yes, it's sort of kind of a faith, if you want to talk about it. I haven't died before, and if I can come back, I'll tell you all about it. So, but that's what the POA practice is.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, panelists, people who attended this session. It's been a pleasure, listening to all of you, all your work, and it makes me proud to really have met you, talk to you, and be able to share this session with you. And I appreciate John and Chris, the techies in my life. And so we'll go from there. So John, if you want to
Oh yeah, I'll stop
cancel
the
us.
recording. Yeah.